Hello and welcome to lecture number 28 of this series, and this lecture and the next two will be dedicated to floral materials. And I noticed in the Perfumer's Apprentice kit that they'd split up the floral materials into white florals and red florals. Now I was familiar with the category of white florals, which are typically things ranging from, let's say, jasmine to tuberose with gardenia, say, in the middle. And they have many things in common, and also lily of the valley would be among those. But the red floral denomination I hadn't come across before, and I think it was a sort of, the idea is that there are things that are derived from rose, which is distinctly a red flower, at least most of the time, or resemble synthetics that resemble rose or are used in rose accords. So that would be my understanding of what they mean by red floral. Extracts of rose come from a variety of different countries, famously Turkey, Bulgaria, Morocco, France. The region of Grasse has a special varietal called May rose. And in fact, Greece, in the northern Greece, in Kozani, there's a whole area which harvests rose. And from what I'm told, the quality of the Greek rose is as good as Bulgarian, which is to say absolutely excellent. And it is back-breaking work because the yield is about 0.1%. So you get 1 kilo of rose absolute for 1 ton of roses. They have to be picked at the right moment, the right time of day. And a ton of roses is an awful lot. I would probably fill this room. So this is clearly going to mean that the absolute will be expensive stuff, and it very much is. It's among the most expensive materials. Once you have the absolute, you can do distillations and separate parts of it. And I remember smelling, for example, at Man, there is a rose DM, where DM stands for distillation moléculaire, molecular distillation, which is a vacuum distillation. And that rose DM, which is used in the perfume Une Rose by Frédéric Malle, is utterly sensational. The one I have here is Moroccan rose, and this strip I dipped 3 days ago, and it's still going very strong. And this strip, which I dipped a few minutes ago, is very, very intense. And it's kind of interesting because there's something peculiar going on there. You know, if you look at the composition of an oil like this, it would be, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but let's say 50% phenylethyl alcohol, which we'll come to in a minute, and then 30% geraniol, and then other things. And if you make a mixture of the two main components, the geraniol and, let's say, the phenylethyl alcohol, and you smell it in comparison, it's nowhere near as powerful. It's as if the remainder, while not necessarily smelling as rosy as the two main materials, contributes to the power. There is a mysterious power to naturals, which I don't think is fully understood. Now, when I say rose absolute is expensive, I mean it. When I had the good fortune of visiting the Joy by Patou production line in Paris, I was shown around the place, and they had these metal vessels with a screw top of Bulgarian rose, which was an essential ingredient in Patou's Joy in those days. And I believe the cost at the time was something like $35,000 a kilo for the absolute. And so each one of these containers will probably be worth well over $100,000. So unsurprisingly, they were stored in a safe, and the safe itself was refrigerated. I don't think I've ever seen a refrigerated safe before. You don't ordinarily need it. But it was, you know, every evening they would lock it and put the combination on. And then the mixture of the different ingredients, and they were beautiful ingredients in Joy, was put in a superb looking steel drum with a brass plate that said Joy with a tap, and the bottles were filled from that. So rose oil, very, very expensive stuff. Fortunately, you don't need a lot because of its power, and you can always use it to add a natural touch and then fill in the sort of majority of the rose note with very cheap synthetics. So this Moroccan rose, I must confess, I'm not overly impressed with. It's the only rose absolute in the Perfumer's Apprentice kit. I don't know why they picked this one. It may be a question of cost. I mean, remember, this is, if it is $30,000 a kilo, then it's $30 a gram. So this is about $150 worth of rose absolute. So maybe it was a question of cost. I don't know. I find this Moroccan rose underwhelming, to be honest. It smells too much like the cheap materials that are majority components. It's sweet, it's somewhat flat. It smells of phenylethyl alcohol, which we'll come to in a minute. It's not the best rose. I don't know what the best rose is today. I suspect the great nations like Turkey and Bulgaria that have been supplying it are still as good as ever, but I don't have them here. So the first synthetic material of the rose family that I'm going to talk about today is phenylethyl alcohol. And it's a very old material. I think it's the beginning of the 20th century, and it's been used extensively in just about every rose fragrance ever since, because it costs, I don't know, maybe $30 a kilo instead of 30,000. So you can see how somebody would try and use as much of this as possible. What does it smell of? Well, if I hadn't smelled rose, the proper one, just before, I would have said rose. But once you smell that, you realize everything that's wrong with this fellow. It feels like bits of a rose hollowed out and taken apart. It's got a benzenic smell to it, definitely. It's sweet, it's rosy, it's slightly soapy, but it's really rather chemical. So you know that if you put too much of this and not enough of something else to offset it, you're going to end up with a very, very cheap smelling rose smell. Now, phenylethyl alcohol happens to illustrate some of the things that I was talking about in the first 15 lectures of this series, namely, what is the relationship between molecular structure and actual odor character? Because I had the opportunity recently to order some phenylethylamine. Phenylethylamine is the starting point for many neurotransmitters. What's interesting is that if you compare the smell of phenylethyl alcohol, which this is, and phenylethylamine, from what I've told you about the fact that we can smell functional groups, you would expect that we would smell rose plus fish, because amine group confer a fishy smell. So I can imagine that it's quite hard to envisage something smelling both rosy and fishy. But when I got the phenylethylamine in the lab and I opened it up, I was stunned, because it is actually quite repulsive. But it's exactly that. It's a sweet rose smell with a very strong fishy angle. So that again illustrates the fact that we smell functional groups separate from the carbon skeleton of a molecule. That was quite fun. So the third compound that we're going to smell today is geraniol, which is a major component in all extracts of rose, and comes in two versions, geraniol and nerol, which are isomers of each other. Now, this is much more citrus-like than phenylethyl alcohol. Much fresher, much more pleasant. It lacks the benzenic aspect that I was talking about. If I compare it to phenylethyl alcohol, you can see phenylethyl alcohol is greener and more benzenic. This fellow is fresher, lemonier. But what's interesting is that it's not actually a very convincing rose, but if you put them together at the right distance, then you get something which is unquestionably rose. Now, Geraniol also illustrates an interesting aspect of fragrance chemistry, which is that you can replace a benzene ring with the tail end of Geraniol and keep a smell which is fairly similar. You can do that. I have done that. And interestingly, in the vibrational spectra, they come out very similar. Now, the next material that we're going to discuss today is Beta-damascone. So the damascones were discovered as a component of rose oil a long time ago, I think in the 60s, I believe, or even the 50s. And they are related to ionones, the smells of violets, which we will deal with in the next lecture, by a transposition of the double bond and carbonyl group in the side chain. Beta-damascone, I was less familiar with. I was much more familiar with the alpha and the delta damascones, but the beta-damascone has a definite rosy aspect, a sour, citrusy aspect as well, and just like beta-ionone, it also has a dry, nutty, musty angle to it, which is very distinctive and very interesting, and would give some spine. If you put this in a rose composition, it would give it a little bit of stiffness, because one of the problems with rose compositions that include, let's say, a small amount of rose oil and then phenylethyl alcohol and then geraniol is they tend to be somewhat soggy and soft and sweet and how would I describe it? Mawkish, I think would be the right word. So these damascones, with their strange astringent quality, especially the beta-damascone, would be great to just sharpen up the composition so it doesn't get too much too soft. In French, they call romance novels romans à l'eau de rose, rose water novels. And I can see that. This is definitely not material for a rose water novel. This would be a bit racier than that. So the next material I'm going to smell today is Rhodinol, which is an isomer of geraniol. It has double bonds in different positions. One of them is missing and the other one's shifted. So it's similar overall in carbon skeleton, but subtly different from geraniol. And the smell is really rather wonderful. It's again a citrus rose, but more evenly balanced between citrus and rose, and with a new character, which is definitely waxy. It feels soapy and waxy. Now, of course, the waxy character is not a very prominent character, especially in compositions. You could easily use this. I think, my guess would be, I'm not a perfumer, of course, but my guess would be that it would give a touch of realism to a rose composition, because when you smell roses on the plant, there often is a definite waxy, slightly sharp, almost candle wax aspect. This is a really beautiful molecule. Some of the grades of Rhodinol, from what I understand, that are sold commercially contain a mixture of this particular molecule and citronellol, which is an isomer. It like 60-40 or 40-60 now. So I suspect this is because it has the cast. Oh, no, it says mixture, indeed. So I thought it had actually cast number, which would mean it was pure. So this is a mixture of unknown proportions of citronellol and Rhodinol. So the next material, which I was not familiar with, also in the floral red category, is Lilithol. And I was a bit surprised actually that they put it in the floral red when I first smelt it, because it's very much what I would describe as a white flowers smell. It is clearly intended as a replacement for hydroxycitronellal. Hydroxycitronellal, because it had an alcohol OH hydroxy and an aldehyde al on the molecule, on a sort of a rosy citrusy skeleton, it had both the freshness of the alcohol and the intensity of the aldehyde, and it was an absolutely irresistibly wonderful lily of the valley material. For example, Geranium, which was and still is the reference lily of the valley fragrance, contained a big slug of hydroxycitronellal, and I've heard it said, I mean, this is in part maybe a legend, but I've heard it said that Edmond Rhodinol, who composed Geranium, actually planted lily of the valley in his garden, and when he was composing Geranium, he would take a smelling strip to the garden and compare the smelling strip to the flower. Lily of the valley, the flower itself, is a preposterously nice smell. I consider lily of the valley and gardenia to be, in some sense, proofs of the existence of God, by which I mean they're not simply meant to attract pollinating insects, because even something much less interesting than that would have done it. I must say, I find this Lilithol truly, truly delightful. It's really beautiful. It feels good. It's put me in a good mood. You breathe more easily when you smell something as wonderful as this. So the final material today is a symrise molecule called maiantol, and it's distantly related in structure to phenylethyl alcohol. It has a few more methyl groups on it. I really don't see what this has to do with red flower accords. It's very much a beautiful lily of the valley adjunct. It's creamy. This fellow has a bit more weight to it. It's extremely smooth. It's just lovely. It's really absolutely beautiful smell. And feels very natural, even though there's nothing that I can think of in nature that really smells like this. It somehow smells natural, by which I mean, again, if someone said, well, this is an extract of the rose from the Kerguelen Islands or something, I would go, wow. Here you have an array, a formidable array of synthetics. All of them, I imagine, fairly cheap. I'm looking at the structural formula. I don't think they're nightmares to produce. And with these guys, well, you can make a terrific rose or lily of the valley or white or red flowers, whatever you want to call it, and then add a touch of the expensive rose oil just to give it that luxurious sheen, that sort of veneer of naturalness. And you've done it.